We're back with Simon Rosenberg of Hopium Chronicles, Tom Bonier of Target Smart, the best data guys in the game. Let's just go through what we're seeing in the early voting numbers, in the overall polling data that we're seeing both nationally and in the swing states. Simon, we started with Tom last time. First, let's start with your overall impressions of what's going on, Simon.
Yeah, look, I think the polling remains remarkably stable and consistent. We've got a 2, 3, 4-point national lead in the battleground states. We are in a better position. We're not where we want to be, but we're in a better position than Trump is. And we just have a stronger capacity in these final 5 days to push the election towards us than they do. I mean, we've got more ads on the air. We've got more people talking to voters. Our campaign is creating far more of a positive spectacle than their ridiculous campaign. And I'm confident that as voters make up their minds in these final few days, that we're going to keep gaining and win this election. I will say that, and Tom will talk about this, the early vote, I think, is also better than is sort of the media narrative right now. We are running at about even with where we were in 2020. 4 years ago, the Republicans have established this benchmark of the comparison to 2020 using largely target early data. And using that benchmark, we're running even with them in the battlegrounds, even though the national vote, the early vote, is about +7 Republican, meaning that we're doing 6 to 7 points better in the battlegrounds than we are in the national vote, which is a sign of the strength of our campaign. We're making the election bluer. And we're also ahead of 2020 in 4 of the 8 states, if you include Nebraska. We're ahead of in Georgia, Michigan, Nebraska, and Wisconsin. So, we are doing well, right? But we need to in these final 5 days, keep working really hard and keep pushing this election towards us so we can have the kind of win on election night that we all want to have.
Bonier, as Simon Rosenberg alluded to, all of these people out there are often citing your data set. When they talk about the Target Smart, Target Early data, it's the data that you're leading, the group that's compiling that data. So when we speak to you, I just want our audience to know that the media gives its spin on your data. We have you on to talk about your actual data. I think that's the way to do it. What are your impressions right now, Tom?
Yeah. Well, look, with early vote analysis, I say this again and again and again. There's way more bad than there is good out there. It's a hard thing to do right. In the end, what we're doing is we're benchmarking, as Simon just did. We have to benchmark against these mileposts, past elections, against the national numbers. That tells us who is doing better. It's not enough to say who's winning the early vote. That's only one element of this. And, let's keep in mind the case that the Trump campaign has made in looking at this election is that they're going to turn out more of these lower propensity voters. They need to change the electorate. Let's keep in mind from the 2020 electorate. That's why they've been appealing to these younger voters who we know are lower propensity voters. A lot of people had questions of whether or not we would see that happening. So in the early vote, that's something that we're really zooming in on is, yes, we are seeing, as Simon said, small shifts in some of these states, where in some of these states, again, we expected to see this across all of the states because of all the dynamics we've talked about with you in past sessions. The comparison to 2020, which frankly was a low watermark for Republican participation in early voting. There was a mass evacuation from early voting among Republicans because Donald Trump effectively told them to. So that benchmark, we knew that Republicans would be improving upon those numbers. We thought we'd see it everywhere. Simon said it's not actually happening everywhere, and we take that as a very terrorist campaign. But what we're really zooming in on is these low propensity voters, these first-time voters. We're looking at where Republicans have been making gains. How are they making these gains? And the high level that we're seeing is that their gains are generally being fueled by more people who voted on Election Day in 2020 coming out early. Now, that's not without some strategic importance, but in terms of that being a good sign for intensity and changing the electorate, as Donald Trump really needs to do, we're not seeing it in the early vote yet. And I'll leave you with one stat to really underscore that. When we look across the battleground states at the early voters who weren't even registered to vote 4 years ago. So these are the new people coming into the electorate. We've heard from Republicans for 4 years now how they supposedly invested in voter registration. They say they're winning the registration battle in places like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Nevada, Arizona. Well, if that were true, we'd expect to see them doing better with these new registrants in the early vote, given their emphasis on it. What we're actually seeing in terms of partisanship is that the partisanship of these first-time voters, and there's almost 1 million of them in the battleground states who have already cast a ballot, that partisan advantage is not only for Democrats, it's double the partisan advantage Democrats have across the entire universe of early voters. So that's, again, it's an early sign. It's one sign. But if we're testing the theory of the case of how Donald Trump himself tells us they're going to win, we're not seeing it in the early vote.
Tom, when we had you and Simon on last time, we were seeing a lot of these exit polls, if you will, of the people who have actually voted. You referenced it there, these early voters. And the numbers kind of felt, from the perspective of Vice President Kamala Harris or those who support her, almost too good to be true. And we were cautioning our viewers as well, like, there's a lot more there that we have to ingest, and also we have to not forget about election day voting itself. But, you know, I think when you were on last time, there were like 2, maybe 3. Maybe it was Marist and maybe it was Ipsos. But now we have like 5 or 6 of these that are all, to use the term that Simon uses, remarkably consistent with this. And given the fact that, as you just mentioned, more Republicans are voting early now, it always strikes me as surprising. So I want to know if I'm reading too much into it when I see amongst early voters where Republicans are voting more and earlier now. ABC Ipsos, Harris 62-33, CNN 61-36, New York Times Siena, Harris 58-40, Harris X-Poll, Harris 61-32, USA Today Suffolk 63-34, and I think Marist was like 55-44. What is this? What am I looking at here?
It's, you know, we all want to be cautious for obvious reasons, but the probability at this point, because again, there are 2 possible explanations for this, and generally we want to go to the simplest, most obvious one. That one explanation is that literally every single one of these pollsters has independently sampled too many Democrats in their early vote model. I don't know what the probabilities of that would be, that they've all independently made that same error, but that's very unlikely at this point. We can say that now that we've seen this many polls. The other more obvious solution or answer to this question is that we're seeing a lot of crossover voting. We have been saying for weeks and weeks now in our conversations here that we know that these unaffiliated voters tend to lean much more Democratic than they have in past cycles. I think that's one element of this. We also know that Republicans who vote before Election Day, when we look at the 2020 data, early voting Republicans were actually significantly more likely to vote for President Biden than Election Day Republicans. So it's possible, and that's what this polling would suggest, that we're seeing just more of that Republican crossover. We do know, we looked at the data in Pennsylvania and looked at the Republican early voters. We found that an overwhelming number of those registered Republicans who have voted already in Pennsylvania also voted early in the presidential primary, the Republican presidential primary in Pennsylvania this year. The reason that's important is those results were broken out after the primary. Those voters were way more likely to vote for Nikki Haley than the Election Day voters. So people have been asking about those Haley voters and where they are going. Again, the picture is starting to come into clearer focus, and it seems to be pointing into more crossover voting in this early vote, which again is a very good early sign for the Harris campaign.
Simon, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Tom just said. And I think that the only way to make the numbers work, right? Because today we are ahead in the national early vote by 2 points over the Republicans. And we're ahead in those polls, as you showed, and maybe we can put it up again so people can see it. We're ahead in those polls by, much bigger numbers. And so, as Tom mentioned, the polling of the early vote isn't subject to some of those same problems of predicting the electorate that some of the other polling is. And so it suggests that we are doing much better than the representation of the Democrat-Republican registration of who's voted so far. And what's the explanation for that? I mean, the explanation, as Tom said, is that we're getting a higher percentage of the unaffiliated voters and that we're seeing evidence of crossover. I mean, one of the things that I've heard from talking to people on the ground in these states is that where many of these Republicans, these sort of early surge Republicans were, particularly in places like North Carolina and Nevada, that they're coming from places that Haley did well in the same legislative districts and the state Senate districts. This is a little bit conjecture. I don't want to go too far, but the point is all of this kind of makes sense, right? That there is some of that surge Republicans got that they were crowing about was actually, it appears to be Republicans voting for Harris, not for Trump, which is a little bit of a problem. And I will just tell you, reflecting back on the way the Harris campaign has conducted itself over the last 6 weeks, you don't use up a lot of the candidates' time on stuff that isn't working or that has a high likelihood of succeeding, right? Because the most valuable asset you have in a campaign is the candidate's time. Think about how much time Kamala Harris has spent working potential Republican crossover voters for her. It's been a major undertaking of the campaign in the last 6 weeks. And they would only be doing it if they had a great assurance that it would be worth their effort, meaning that they were seeing in their own data that there was a big chunk of the Republican electorate that was available to them, that Liz Cheney and Olivia Troy and others were being successful at creating this permission structure for Republicans to leave. Ben, in your own universe here of the Meidas Mighty, right, that you've had a lot of anecdotal evidence of people who are followers of yours and viewers of this show who have acknowledged that they were Republicans and they voted early. And so, I mean, all of this, let me take one step back because we're getting into the weeds here a little bit. The most important thing I can convey here is there actually really isn't any good data anywhere for the Republican Party right now. And the only good data that they really have that, because they're not doing nearly as well in the early vote as they should be, frankly, in my view. I'm not sure where we are exactly where we want to be either, but they've grossly exaggerated their performance in the early vote. And as we know that if they're saying anything and they're spinning anything very hard, the likelihood of it being true is very low, right? Because that's just generally they lie about everything. The only good data they really have is data that has been generated through these fake polls that they've been flooding the zone with, now over 100 polls that have pushed the polling averages and pushed some of the forecasters into making the election look like it's going towards Trump. In my own Hopium work today, the latest data, polls taken since the 14th of October, independent polls, national polls, Harris is up 2.5 points. In the red wave polls, Trump is up by a point. There's a 3 to 4 point difference. But that difference in the flooding of the zone has sort of tipped some of the forecasters. But if you take that stuff out, right, and you look at just the independent polling in the battleground states and in the national electorate, the election looks much more favorable to Harris. Ben, this is exactly what I was telling you 2 years ago, right? When I came on here with Tom right before the last election, we said, if you take out these red wave polls, it looks like a close competitive election. This time, if you take out the red wave polls, it looks like an election that's leaning towards Harris. And so, that's why I'm confident and comfortable that I would much rather be us than them with 5 days to go at this point, looking at the totality of the data that's in front of us.
Let's talk about some other trends that we're seeing, Tom. Women voting, the gender gap. Is this surprising data to you? Is it consistent with what we just heard Simon say? I mean, if you look in a lot of these states, we look at Pennsylvania, female early voters plus 13, Michigan plus 12, Wisconsin plus 8, Georgia plus 12, North Carolina plus 11, Arizona a little less, plus 4, and Nevada, as of the time of this, women are voting less than men. Men are plus 1 in Nevada. Normally, when we would see early votes, 2020 is an odd, is obviously a COVID year, but like if this was a normal election, would I expect to be seeing plus 12 female, plus 13 female, is because they vote earlier in general, or would these usually look more even? Just I don't know. So you tell me with the historical perspective.
I don't know what a normal election is anymore. I don't think we've had one of those in a while. But yeah, women generally do vote more before election day. They've tended to vote more in the early vote. I think what's striking to me about these gender gap numbers is if you view it in the context of these massive Republican efforts and focus and investment in moving their voters to early voting, you would expect to see these numbers closer. And this is really reflecting what Simon was talking about at the top of the conversation. The fact is they aren't moving the numbers. So those gaps are in the same neighborhood that they were at this point in 2020. That's important. And actually, if you look at some of the sub-demographics, what's interesting to me, in many of these key battleground states, you're actually seeing bigger gender gaps than 2020 among sort of both ends of the age spectrum, meaning the youngest voters and the oldest voters are seeing these bigger gender gaps. That makes sense. You ask, did we expect this? We know that since Dobbs in 2022 and our experience in the 2022 elections and then special elections since, the voters who seem to be most mobilized since Dobbs are younger women and women over the age of 65 for different reasons. You know, we've seen that women over the age of 65, many of them remember what it was like pre-Roe versus Wade, and they're very much committed to not seeing us go back there, or at least further back there than we've gone in the last 2 years. They need to see that reversed. Younger women being more directly impacted by the Dobbs decision. So again, it's a small element of this. I do expect, in terms of seeing a potential Dobbs surge and bigger gender gaps, those younger women, we would expect to see more of them coming out on election day. So in terms of the work ahead of the campaign, I think that's something they're aware of and are building around that bigger turnout operation of younger women, especially going into next Tuesday.
Now, this is the part of the show where I let each of you freestyle. If we didn't cover any specific aspect of it, if you just want to get a message out there, the floor is yours first. Simon, we will start with you.
Yeah, two final points. One is one of the things that you hear a lot in the commentary is that Trump always overperforms his public polling and did in 2016 and 2020. And I just want to address that for a second. Number one, he didn't overperform his public polls in 2016. The election was changed by James Comey at the end. The polls are actually very accurate. So when you hear Republicans say he overperformed his public polls in 2016, that's not true. And they invented that as a meme in order to cover over what actually happened, which is that the head of the FBI changed the election and gave it to Trump at the end of the election in 2016. In 2020, he did overperform his polls. But since Dobbs, there's been a consistent sort of one election, as Tom and I discussed, is there's been one election, which is that we've been overperforming expectations in polls and they've been underperforming them. You saw this throughout 2022 and 23 and 24. You saw it with Trump himself. And Ben, we talked about this last time I was on. In 19 of the 20 early primary states, he underperformed public polling in this election. This is 2024. It's not 2020. And we know that the fascists in Europe and in France also dramatically underperformed their public polls. And so there's a lot of evidence that what's happening now, based on people that I've spoken to that have been doing focus groups and so on, is that this outer edge of the Trump coalition, the part of the Trump coalition that they need to win and to get above the margin they got last time, that they're struggling to vote for him. That what you've seen, what's happened repeatedly is that parts of the Republican coalition that are non-MAGA, that when it came time to voting and the gravity of the decision was weighing on them as opposed to sort of just answering a poll, that a bunch of them spit the bit and just couldn't go there. And this time there was also a massive campaign starting with the Democratic Convention to talk to them about the need to not vote for Trump. And we know from our internal work, our internal data and research, that this fear of voting for Trump or the worry about voting for Trump started being volunteered in focus groups just a few weeks ago without prompting. And that would make sense because people are now have to actually vote. And they're looking at his ugliness and his extremism, and something that is deeply evident in his performance in the last few weeks. Nobody does a better job than you, Ben, in reminding us of his daily ugliness, right? And I think that this is helping us. I feel this is a very positive development because the fundamental reality of our politics is that MAGA has been the driving force that fear and opposition to MAGA has been the driving force of our politics in 2018, in 2020, in 2022, throughout elections in 2023 and 2024, as it should be, because it is actually the most important issue in our politics. Because what Donald Trump's closing argument is that I want to end the global economy that's made America prosperous. I want to end the Western alliance that has kept us safe. And I want to end American democracy that's kept us free. And that's literally his closing argument. And so the idea that there are lots of people now at the end when they have to go vote starting to spit the bit, as they did in all these previous elections in the US and as they did in Europe with a very similar set of politics, should not be surprising to anybody. And in fact, we're seeing it in the data, right? So I end here 5 days out, very optimistic that we're in a better position than them. And if we all go out and work as hard as we can, harder than we've ever done anything, we are much more likely to win this election and have the election we want than they are.
Simon Rosenberg, Tom Bonier, your semi-closing argument, because we're definitely getting you guys back on here before election day.
Well, that's a tough act to follow in Simon, but I want to connect a couple of dots here quickly. I see a lot of people out there who are very nervous about this election, and I understand it. The stakes are so high, and it truly appears to be a very close election. But a couple of things, and Simon has really reinforced this, but I want to hammer home the point that there has been such an unprecedented concerted effort to change our perception of this election between the voter registration analysis from Republicans that skews the results, the early vote analysis that we've talked about that skews the results, what Simon has been talking about and blowing the whistle on in the red wave polling, the polling averages, the poly markets of the world. This is all a concerted effort to make people feel that despair and hopelessness. Something else I would point to, President Trump tweeting about supposed fraud and irregularities in Pennsylvania the other day. I will say that a candidate who expects to win an election, who expects to win the vote count, probably doesn't go out before election day and try to undermine the veracity of that vote in advance. So, look, we need to keep in mind that this is a close election, that, as Simon said, we're leading, it's close. And I just want to encourage people to not let any of that make you lose focus. You don't need to engage in those arguments online. Simon and I will take it and provide the real information. Go out, do that work over the closing days.
Yeah, do that work over the closing days. I mean, look, we've built a thesis in building this network of the Meidas voter. I mean, I'm a non-political guy running one of the biggest political networks because I, like so many Americans, don't really love politics, but I care about people. And so I've always viewed our coverage through that kind of prism more than, Democrat, Republican, liberal versus conservative. So to me, the Meidas voter is a common sense voter who just doesn't, to your points, doesn't want fascism, wants normalcy. We don't want to see someone dressing up like a garbage man with weird freaking makeup on their face and having people say horrific things about the Puerto Rican community one day, Latinos another day, Jews another day, women, whether you like it or, so Trump, whether you like it or not, I'm coming for you. I'm protecting you, whether you want me to or not. I'm like, stop. Just let's go forward and let's be normal. I'll leave you with these two comments that I just got while we were shooting this. And as I say, I get like literally thousands of these each day, which is why I'm like, I think there's a trend, but who knows? This person goes, I'm from Michigan, 30 years, born and raised in Texas, always voted red. I'm officially voting blue on my ballot in every vote, state, federal. I'm 60 years old. I'm not only voting for me, I'm voting for my family and my country. Stop the hate. All the Trump mail I receive goes right into the recycle bin. And then Jill also wrote while we were recording this, I'm from Michigan. There's a grassroots effort in every corner of the state. Don't underestimate women in Michigan for the Harris-Walz campaign. We know the agenda. We know our work will make a difference. We are not going back. I can share you hundreds of thousands of comments like that. I just thought at the end, I leave everybody with that. Simon Rosenberg, Tom Bonier, thank you as always for just helping go through this data. And we'll have you back before the election. Let's do one more of these sessions. And everybody, just go out and do something. We still have enough time too for you to be a difference maker. So go out there, help people vote, tell friends, family, coworkers, anybody in your orbit. Let them know. Let them know. All right. Thanks, guys. We'll see everybody later. Hit subscribe. Let's get to 4 million subscribers by election day.
Real quick, Meta just changed their algorithm to suppress political content. Please follow our Instagram at MeidasTouch right now as we head towards 400,000 followers so you don't miss a beat.